Yeah, close enough. Let's go ahead and launch then. So we'll welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to the November edition of Lightning Lounge. I'm Bill Stanley. I'm Associate Provost for Faculty Success, and I get to be the host, MC, for this. I want to thank folks at Advance at UNM for helping to organize this, as well as Center for Teaching and Learning and Barbara Rodriguez here in Academic Affairs. All contribute to this, and the Office of Vice President for Research have all contributed to organizing this. So thanks to them. We'll have 4 presentations today, 7 minutes each, and what we do, we'll have the Q&A and discussion after each one. And Professor Ranita Ray is going to go first. She's actually in her class, and so she's going to go first and then leave after she's done so she can proceed with the rest of her class. So we'll start with her, then we'll have Joseph Ho, then Llewelynn Fletcher, and Jose Cerrato in that order. So Professor Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you everyone for being here this beautiful afternoon. I'll keep my presentation short, and I apologize for having to leave right after. My class is here listening in, and we're going to get into some related discussions afterwards. So I'll get right into it. So if you asked me back in 2016, when I was speaking with the overwhelmingly white teaching force and administration of one of the largest public school districts in the US about educational inequalities, whether I could anticipate the 2021 critical race theory ban sweeping the nation, alongside conversations around when to teach our children, read subtext white children, about racism, I would in fact have emphasized its inevitability. In fact, my conversations with teachers and administrators, their attitude toward the Black, Latinx, Asian, immigrant, trans, fat, and disabled children they taught motivated me to enter the school and classrooms in this large Western city and observe how teachers and administrators responded to marginalized children inside classrooms and schools. I started observing a cohort of 80 primarily economically marginalized Black, Latinx, Asian, and recent immigrant students, some of whom were trans, disabled, and fat, across 4 classrooms, 2 to 3 days a week in the 4th grade. What I witnessed compelled me to continue to follow the same class over 3 years as they moved from 4th to 6th grade. The everyday emotional, psychological, cultural, and political violence, along with indifference, cruelty, and the erasure of intellect marginalized children encountered inside the classroom, rendered the school a violent institution for them. Dominant conversations around educational inequalities in the US that center funding, segregation and integration, and achievement gap actually overshadow this everyday violence marginalized children encounter in the classroom. It overshadows the urgency to understand the implications of a primarily white architect or urban public schools that serve majority economically marginalized students of color. And it divorces contemporary public education from its historical legacy as a primary institution for state-sponsored and sanctioned violence. Public education has never, in fact, served as a vehicle for social mobility or racial and gender democracy. A strong group of scholars have argued and continue to demonstrate the need to distinguish education from schooling and to urgently underline how schooling in the US are actually technologies of oppression that have historically shaped and continue to shape Black subjugation, indigenous cultural genocide, and colonial expansion. Yet, we continue to marginalize this conversation both within academia and in larger public discourse, which actually throws into sharp relief the university itself as the racialized organization that is invested in a white nation state. Through my 3 years of ethnographic observations, interviews with teachers and administrators, and archival research, I document in my in-progress book how even schools that embrace multicultural curriculum, culturally relevant pedagogy, and anti-racism continue to reinscribe racial violence and other forms of violence among inside schools. Some examples. I witnessed how multiple teachers taught about racism inside schools only in the realm of KKK. And these are in schools that embrace multicultural curriculum. One teacher equated racial discrimination to discrimination based on height. And another teacher resented when students attempted to make the connection between their lessons in Rosa Parks and Colin Kaepernick's protest. Most teachers also resented centering students of colors and their histories and realities. One teacher, for example, complained about not having White History Month while she was putting up posters about local indigenous communities in her classroom. Another teacher mocked a paraprofessional with Asian accent in front of students, leading many students to bully a Chinese American peer. Yet another teacher loudly chided a Black student, calling him disgusting because he hugged her just as she hugged all her students. Teachers called Black girls who dressed up Barbie, constantly predicting that Black and Latinx boys in their class would become drug dealers or gang members, and lectured 10, 11, and 12-year-olds on teen pregnancy. In interviews I conducted, teachers used racial slurs, talked about the threat of illegals, and lamented the growing immigrant population of this city, among other things. Now you might be thinking, but are these aberrations? Are they specific to the school district you studied? Unfortunately, they're not. They very much reflect the countless stories of white teachers demeaning and harassing students of color across the nations that surface in the news and social media almost every day. Whether it's a teacher walking on Black students' back during slavery lesson, using the N-word, dressing up as the wall, or mocking indigenous culture and practices during math lessons, these are only some of the stories that have surfaced in the media very recently. Online classes during COVID-19 have exposed some marginalized parents to the cruel treatment their children endure in the classrooms. Yet, we're urged to assume that white teachers and administrators who make up 80% of our public school personnel and teach a student body that is more than half racially marginalized have definite intentions of treating our most marginalized children fairly and equally. Recent visibility cast on the rise of ever-present white supremacist discourses in the US has exposed its widespread prevalence across institutions, medicine, police and prisons, media, and to state some of the few. Studies also demonstrate that teachers and administrators are not distinct from other white Americans in the racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and other things. It is time then we took seriously the implications of a white teaching force that itself is a consequence of racialized policies and programs like Brown versus Board that took out Black teachers and administrators from the classroom and schools who are in charge of marginalized children inside classrooms. What are the consequences of having white architects for Black and Brown education? Thank you, that's all.
Thank you very much. So we'll take questions or comments. Anyone feel free.
So this is José Cerrato. Thank you, Ray, for this very, how can I say, challenging exposition, right, of issues that we deal with in schools and even in universities. We had a really good conversation today with some colleagues of my own scientific community about the issues that you discussed. So I guess my question would be, with the knowledge that we have and also with the intention of diversity and inclusion in all of our institutions, what do you think we should, how should we move in a way that we can make progress, right? Because as you say, as much as we want to be optimistic, well, the facts that you mentioned, reflect what the reality is, right? So what's your perspective on that?
Thank you so much, Jose, for the fantastic question. I mean, I first want to point to Savannah Shange's fantastic new book called Progressive Dystopia, which outlines how even in the most progressive schools, policies and programs are based on the exclusion of Black students and violence against Black students. And honestly, I find myself pessimistic unless we're really able to embrace radical resolutions and really think in the direction of abolition. And people often a sort of question, well, that's huge, that's big, but I don't think there are other options, to be honest with you. And often I'm afraid that my critiques of white architects might be taken as a critique of labor union, but it's not. I, in fact, think that issues of labor are fundamentally racialized, and racial justice is labor justice. So I think labor unions can play a really big role in ensuring that we mandate there are Black, brown, queer, immigrant teachers in the classrooms. In my book, I discussed how not only historical policies and programs, but contemporary hiring discrimination often keeps Black and brown teachers out of the classroom. So unions can advocate for that. And I think personally, I think diversity and inclusion have become sort of commodities that corporations have used to green sky white supremacy. So I think we need to ensure that communities can self-determine what type of education they want and how they educate their children. Sorry, I went on and on. But yeah, I think we need to have fresh, radical perspectives in thinking about public education.
Ranita, I remember at my daughter's elementary school, the principal, I think is basically when they were graduating from fifth grade, announcing that, some percentage of you 12 years from now will be in jail. So it very much aligns with what you've just described. There was sort of a gasp that went through the room. And I'm wondering, all right, given that achieving descriptive representation in classrooms and in academic administration is a project of many years, are there effective educational training programs that can be directed at educators and educational administrators so they don't do things like that? I mean, is some of this violence avoidable?
Yeah. Thank you, Bill. That's a great question. I honestly, I can't say that I have a really good, intelligent, or effective answer to your question. But what I do find that, culturally sensitive or relevant pedagogy and anti-racism training can often fall short because they're predicated on the assumption that we can educate away white supremacy. We can educate away years of racial oppression, where in fact, we don't consider the fact that some of us might actually know white supremacy and continue to still embrace our privilege and benefits we get from it. So I think that honestly, we need to stop thinking about incremental change and really need to think about radical change, because incremental change often comes at the cost of larger changes. So I think we need to think about labor unions advocating for Black, brown, immigrant, queer teachers, disabled teachers, instead of simply thinking about how to train who we already have, because I think often these pedagogical tools can be mobilized. Because in larger forces of white supremacy, misogyny, transphobia, anti-disability are pretty strong, I think. So we really need to think long-term immediately. Sorry, that's not more of a joyous answer.
Not a joyous topic, but thank you for the light you're shedding on it. Appreciate very much your presentation. Thanks. So let's hear next from, and thanks for joining us today in the middle of your class. I appreciate it. And I hope the rest of your class goes well. Thanks very much, Professor Ray.
Very much. I apologize for not being able to attend the talks, but I'll definitely catch up with them with the recordings. Thank you for the great questions and comments. I really appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye. So thanks very much. Next up will be Joseph Ho, a professor in chemistry, talking about In Pursuit of Meaningful Lab Learning. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen with my PowerPoint. Sorry. Sorry, there's a technical problem. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it looks good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Joseph Ho from the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology. I'm an educator and a researcher in chemical education. My research is deeply integrated into my teaching. So I use my finding from the research to improve students' learning and use the observation from my teaching to inspire new research. And it has been a delightful combination for me. Today, I will share with you a long journey of my research about laboratory learning in just 7 minutes. I found this a challenging task. So how was I drawn to the subject of lab learning? My curiosity started by a conversation with my students during a routine lab visit. And our lab was a traditional cookbook lab where students strictly follow the given procedures for their experiments. And she was one of my best students in the class, and I wanted to evaluate her overall understanding of the lab work. So I started with, how are you doing? What are you doing? And I'd expected her to explain the experiment to me. To my surprise, she was only able to read the procedure printed on the manual to me. Apparently, she did not have a picture of the procedure yet. So I started to realize that even the best students could only blindly follow the procedure given in the manual without the comprehension of the experiment. But I did not give up. I moved on to ask her if she knew the tool she used in the lab. So I asked her if she would choose a different tool for the same purpose of the procedure. And once again, she could not answer it because the manual did not mention it. So this conversation brought me back to my first undergraduate research experience. I feel that even though I had taken several lab courses prior to working in the faculty's lab, I was not prepared by any of the previous lab work. From the conversation, I could see the same frustration the student had with the lack of purpose for the experiment she did. So then I asked myself, what is the purpose of the undergraduate lab courses? Have we taught them something useful for their next step? In other words, how do we make the lab learning meaningful to our students? So I looked through the literature and I found there has not been a consensus about the purpose of student laboratory learning. Some educators focus on the lab techniques, and others stress down the science literacy. And because of the concern about safety, particularly in chemistry, and limitation of times and resources, most of the undergraduate chemistry lab have been implemented as a procedure-based lab. And this cookbook approach has deprived students of curiosity and creativity, providing a wrong demonstration about how scientists work in the lab. Because no chemists work in the cookbook approach in the real life. Students took a cookbook lab, missed the opportunity to appreciate how chemists would do in the lab. So for me, this is a big miss of what the purpose of the lab course is. The most damaging from the cookbook approach, in my opinion, is the misconception that given the procedure will always lead to perfect data, because the scheduled lab do not allow students to repeat their procedure. Students usually miss the most important elements of the lab work, and that is learning from the mistakes. From my observation about cookbook approaches, I found evidence pointed away from the meaningful learning for our students. So I decided to do something to change it. During the course of 24 years, from 1998 to 2021, I have implemented 9 major interventions in our lab courses with one goal, that is to increase the meaning of the undergraduate students' chemistry lab learning. And the most recent effort is the introduction of the course-based undergraduate research experience, or CURE. And this approach has created the most significant increase of the students' learning from different measures. Here I present 2 performance charts to demonstrate the effect of CURE. And this data was collected between the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2021. The chart on the left shows the CURE group outperforms the non-CURE group by 5-fold. So 25% gains from the CURE group versus 5% gains from the non-CURE group in the concept learning. And the chart on the right shows the CURE group also did better in the assessment of the practical skills. I have also seen better improvement of students' ability of making scientific arguments with the CURE group. Most importantly, the CURE students are able to learn how to work as a chemist, which makes their learning more meaningful. Have I found a way to meaningful learning yet? I don't know, but I think I'm getting closer to the answer. I believe my time is up. Thank you for your listening.
Thanks very much. What questions do folks have?
Thanks for that talk. I'm curious about if you've found or done any studies on if CURE methodology translates outside of the chemistry lab. I teach in a sculpture lab, and I'm really interested in a similar set of how things can be shifted for more effective learning. And I'm curious if you've done any studies outside of your particular labs.
Unfortunately, I think so far I've been focusing on chemistry only. But I did have some conversation with the disciplines outside of chemistry. And I was able to think about something that's, not in the realm of chemistry. I think the big principle is when we try to make a change, and we need to make a small steps at a time and see how the students respond to it before we can make another step. And that's why I have taken so many years for me to make the change. And but I think that the basic idea of the CURE is we bring the practice of the field to students in our class setting. So anything we can do to show them, this is how, the chemists, or in your field, I think you're fine arts, right? So how the artists will perform their work, and we let the students to experience that. And so anything we could do to bring this experience into our classroom, I think that would be useful. And again, we like to bring a small step at a time, and just carefully collect the data to see how they respond to that before we make the next step. That's my experience.
I'd just like to make a comment, if I might. Billy Brown here. Thank you very much, Joseph, for your presentation. It really has me thinking about how in the statistics course I teach to freshmen and sophomores, how I can begin to break away from the formulaic approach like you talked about. We teach the students procedures, and then we expect them to follow those procedures and use those procedures in possibly unfamiliar circumstances. But I think maybe we focus too much on procedures and not enough on creative thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that's very true, and lots of applications that we can let the students to consider during the class, and there's just lots of opportunities that we can help the students to make the transfer from the knowledge they're seeing from this class, and then the knowledge they might be able to use in the future. Thank you for your comment.
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much for that presentation. And thanks for your years of persistent experimentation on what works in the lab setting. It's very, very important and innovative work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we'll hear from Professor Llewelynn Fletcher from Fine Arts, Material Impact Sculpture as a Method Toward Enhanced Receptivity. Llewelynn. I'm not hearing you, Llewelynn. I think you're...
Now I believe you will hear me. Is that okay? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this invitation. My name is Llewelynn Fletcher. It's my third year here at UNM as an assistant professor of sculpture with the Department of Art, Studio History, and Education. And my talk today is called Material Impact. My sculpture practice addresses the body by creating spaces and objects that can be used as locations for positive transformational experiences and to really build muscle in our physical and somatic intelligence. So this is an artwork called Please Lie Down, Galaxy, that I created about 10 years ago. And it was really one of the starts of this decade-long material research. I utilize raw materials in my work to communicate in body-based terms, so weight, texture, temperature, scent, and sound reflection. This piece is turned basswood, and basswood is a domestic hardwood resonant with the human voice frequency range, often used for acoustic guitar making. And this piece is also in basswood. And these pieces really are framing the body of no longer viewer, because it's less about viewing and more about participating. So really kind of having a frame that directs attention to the body of the participant and kind of puts people into what I hope is a receiving mode, real activation of listening. I'm a big believer that if I'm just in these talks, if I'm really open and receptive and listening, I can actually be changed by receiving new information. I can let that kind of swirl around with what I already know and come out pretty different. So that's my kind of efforts in these works. My research really is carving this diagonal trajectory through feminist and queer studies, phenomenology, animal studies, science fiction, all with kind of a focus on taking aim at this point at human exceptionalism itself. This is a claim which has led to a culture that we live in that has severe consequences for non-human people and is tied intimately to fabricated hierarchical divides within human kinships as well. In my recent work, my investigations have embraced more and more these themes of human-animal kinship, what we can learn from other beings we share this planet with, and our body's central role in becoming attuned to and being able to receive that new information. These are two scholars that are aligned with my thinking. I pulled a couple quotes from some of those books that I'd clamped together. Carrie Wheel from Thinking Animals, Why Study Animals Now, Why Animal Studies Now. She says, our engagement with animals may reveal to us our particular human stupidity. And it is only by deeply attending to animals, or more precisely, by becoming attuned to them, that we may be able to overcome some of the limitations of our so-called rational condition. There's this long tradition, of course, in Western philosophy that really has declared our capacity for rational thought and its manifestation in language as that which distinguishes human from non-human animals, and kind of identifying that that might be more of a liability and limitation at this point with what we've done to it, and how can we turn towards other forms of intelligence to gain some much needed wisdom and sort of shift our participation in destructive actions. Donna Haraway says in When Species Meet, I'm advocating the understanding that earthly heterogeneous beings are in this web together for all time, and no one gets to be man. And so I'm going to kind of shift. Those are the ideas behind the work. And what I've been doing at UNM is really focusing on amplifying my own skill level with a blending of digital and analog tools. So the standing sound costume lion uses a weaving of digital and analog tools and techniques. The benefits of working digitally are easy scale shifts, repeatable forms, flexibility to generate an object in multiple materials, while I remain also rooted in the handmade and the analog. And so here's another example of a digital form, a digital 3D model that's been sliced, carved on a CNC router, and then reassembled and hand touched and put together. I really see the dialogue of analog and digital marks in these recent works as identifying not just my particular practice, but there's this larger tension of our contemporary evolved human tool use as they kind of weave back and forth. So just an example of a studio sketch as I kind of not using these digital technologies as much for idea than fabrication, but more as drawing and sculpting tools. This is an example of a feather pattern that is carved into a solid bar of aluminum. And in one, a tool is 1/8 of an inch, and in another, it's 1/32 of an inch. And with the same design, there's a very different composition. So this is really also kind of a collaboration with the instrument itself. And here's just an example. I didn't know the sound would go on that one. That's a CNC router at work, carving in my studio and just kind of reading the digital drawing. Another example of engraving of elephant skin translated through Illustrator, carved into aluminum bar. I'm working on a PERC grant, also with some colleagues in my department here, to establish a new interdisciplinary fabrication lab where we can have at the university some sophisticated tools that could be used throughout the university. Some just results of some of these explorations that are a recent solo show called Elephant Shoe presented this summer. And these pieces are really utilizing the texture of animal species as the representation, and digital and analog fabrication processes, and then this kind of palette of body-based materials such as aluminum, brass, local hardwoods, and clay. And my sort of final thought, sculpture offers a physical encounter with this unspeaking material and form, thus insisting on an engagement with an other that we cannot anthropomorphize or make similar to ourselves. In this way, sculpture can offer an encounter with not knowing, causing us to listen with our whole body, possibly amplifying capacity for compassion and care for the many bodies also unlike our own. And I'm just going to scroll through these last images of examples of this recent work. I've also been thinking a lot about the recent sculpture conversations at an international level around monuments and the body of a monolith, and sort of taking apart those monoliths into many pieces. We are composed of many parts. We are also always engaged in interacting with other beings. So these are sculpture bodies that are water jet cut, aluminum, brass, and steel, and they are interchangeable parts. This is my most recent artwork just from this last summer. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. my reaction is, wow, how do you come up with some of those things? Amazing. We have a question from Mala. Mala Tud, go ahead.
This is so interesting, and I just love the way that you talked about sculpture as a way to teach about how to encounter the other, that the other cannot be, may not even be able to be understood at all, but certainly can't be assimilated or incorporated. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it seems incredibly relevant to contemporary, political discussions and ethical discussions. And so, I mean, is this something that you could see like generalizing or, incorporating into curriculum?
I teach a seminar. I taught a graduate seminar last year called Material Impact. Thanks for noticing that. I think you saw that in that early work, I was really trying to kind of frame the viewer and do these, I think now, manipulations, and really coming more and more to see the power that sculpture can have in a time where this kind of poetic experience of not being able to fully understand something, but what that can potentially bring out. I think it's incredibly relevant. I think, a lot of the interest and the ideas, William, to go to your question, come from reading, queer and feminist studies, these ways that Llewelynn Sisu would manipulate language to make new language. There's always these new words and terms being invented because of the limitations of language as it's been, to kind of break it open and put it together. And so I'm trying to challenge myself in my sculpture work. Honestly, I think talks are such a beautiful way to get to say it over some images, but I really believe that the work can do things that I can't do through explaining. But one of the reasons being in education and an artist is so much more than just making stuff and putting it out in a gallery. There's so many different vantage points that can open up through talks and conferences and an essay and this kind of thing, meeting collaborators. So I think it can be, I don't know, generalized, but definitely keep going, and
keep going.
Yeah, keep going, keep evolving, and honestly, like, team up and collaborate. And it's part of the reason I was excited to be invited today.
I have a quick comment, if I may. Thank you so much for introducing us to communicating, from outside humanity, so to speak, using, of course, your human skills and your human design ideas. I've just completed a huge poetry anthology. I'm interested in more than math and statistics. And I've proposed doing a talk here sometime in the future with some of the poetry in my huge anthology with more than 140 poets. And of course, that would be involved in communicating human feelings and human thoughts and learning more about each other, possibly, rather than learning from unhumans. So I'm fascinated by what you've done, and I hope that I can share some of the poetry in my big anthology. Thank you.
I appreciate you mentioning poetry, because it's something in the 7 minutes that I sort of had to edit out. But the poetry is where it's at for me with art. I think it's another thing that is layered and complex, and doesn't give you an answer. It's not necessarily a billboard. And I'm thinking of my sculptures as poems, as edited, as pieces that you move around. And the more often you read them, the more you get, right? Like a koan, but never a solution. So I really appreciate you bringing that term into the conversation.
Thank you.
I had a question. If there's
Diana, go ahead. Yeah.
So your early work, the one with enclosing the human, made me think about the fact that it's incredibly difficult for me to explain to people how microbes that live on and in us interact with we humans. And I'm wondering if sculpture is a way to bring that to life and make something unseen more seen.
Yes. I love that, Donna Haraway talks about, I like whatever, we think we're wholly human, but how many parasites are we carrying around? Like, we're made up of so many things. And that latest work, those queer bodies, is what I ended up calling it, is where those sort of interchangeable, you're not ever, no one's one thing. We're all interdependent. And at any time, I'm this part of me or that, so yes, I think that it absolutely could do that. I think sculpture can do most everything. I can't do it, but the field of sculpture is pretty powerful.
Thank you for a great presentation.
Well, if I may, I just want to ask one other question, and that is, it sounds to me as if much of your creative process is very intuitive. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you convey to students or guide students, and this is probably a question that requires an hour-long answer, but how do you help guide students to develop their own creative practice?
It's a great question, and I obviously I believe strongly in intuition, but I also believe that you feed that intuition, and if it's sealed off and I'm just working from what I already know, then I'm making work from a very limited place. So I believe in drawing as an act of representation, bringing in new information. And with students, I try and give a lot of examples when I introduce a project, but the prompts are often broad. So we'll look at sculptors, but then there's many, many solutions. So we'll try and pair like a material and technique that they can learn, because sculpture is like infinity in terms of materials and techniques at this point. But then really ask them to pursue, their own interest and trajectory within that. And I think at a student level, not necessarily copying, but looking, finding out who is not just inspiring, but related to your interests. I call it like a constellation that you're a part of. And then finding those sort of overlaps or words and which pieces and why, and just sort of following. It is intuitive, but part of the job, I think, of bringing it to consciousness and then pursuing those things and combining them, that's what I try and kind of help happen and facilitate in the classroom.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation and your remarks. So our final speaker is José Cerrato, speaking on uranium mining legacy in Native American lands. José, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Bill. And well, what a great presentation. To follow up, all I can say is that music was my plan A, but this is my plan B, because it was really hard to make a living out of music for me. But I totally appreciate that. I sometimes can definitely communicate better with music than I can with words, but here we are trying to do our best. Okay, so thanks a lot. I feel very honored to be a part of this talking lounge. And well, my name is José Cerrato. I am an associate professor. This is my 9th year at the University of New Mexico, and I've had the honor and privilege to work with a wide range of colleagues from different places that I want to acknowledge before I start. So first of all, the National Science Foundation for supporting my NSF Career Award, and also the Center for Water and the Environment, to which I am affiliated. And also, believe it or not, the health sciences and main campus can work together. And this is a demonstration of that, what I'm going to talk about today, because this work has also been funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences through the UNM Metal Superfund Center. And also, I want to acknowledge Virginia Tech, because I did some analysis at the National Nanotechnology Infrastructure Center that they have, Nano Earth, and also the Stanford Synchrotron Radiation Light Source, and the amazing facilities that we have, of course, at the University of New Mexico through the Center for Microengineered Materials, the Analytical Chemistry Lab, the Institute for Meteoritics, and others that I will be featuring today. And I see Mike Spildy there, so nice to see you, Mike. And we'll talk about uranium legacy in Native American lands. And I like to just make sure that we realize how close we are to this problem, not only because we are geographically here in New Mexico, where a lot of these mine wastes are located, but also because we are the University of New Mexico. And as a state university, I definitely feel compelled that it is our job to provide our expertise to our Native American tribes on trying to understand an issue that is actually still pending, I want to say, a fair closure, if I can use this word, right? Because this is definitely an environmental justice issue. So we have more than 1,000 abandoned mine waste here in the Western US, and it depends on who you ask. This number could be higher, many of which have received interim or no remedial action. And many of these are rural communities that live in the proximity of this site. So as you can see there in the picture to the top left, there's a house that is located in a mine waste claiming site, right? So human health risks associated with these metal exposures remain poorly understood. And we need fundamental understanding about the fate and transport of these metals, not only to understand risk assessment, but also to come up with appropriate remediation strategies. And, this is just to illustrate some data that we were able to obtain at the analytical chemistry lab with my good friend, Mary Ali. And what we have seen is that in both groundwaters and in surface water, so the groundwaters are from the Blue Gap Tache Navajo Nation, and we see that, as a reference, the maximum contaminant level of established by the Environmental Protection Agency for uranium is 30. And I say as a reference because this is not necessarily drinking water, but at some point in time, believe it or not, people used to drink some of this water as a groundwater source, especially back in the 60s and 70s. And also in the Laguna Rio Paguare, which is just across the Jackpile mine in the Pueblo tribe, we have measured concentrations that go up to 700 micrograms per liter. Okay, and also we have seen the co-occurrence of arsenic, and here just showing some data that is close to the maximum contaminant level or higher of 10 micrograms per liter. So this is just to show that you don't only have a uranium problem here, but that several other metals that occur, arsenic, vanadium, and others, can be present and at waters of different qualities. And I show pH here because you could have regular drinking waters or you could have waters that are actually pretty acidic. So in this context, then we see here, I love this picture because it just shows you there's the house and there are the animals that graze in these areas. And also, I was standing above the Claim 28 site in Blue Gap Tache, and I took this picture which shows you if it rains where the drainage goes to these ponds, which is where the animals drink their waters. What we have found, and this is thanks to Mike Spieldy and Adrian Burley, through the integration of different microscopy techniques, is that in this Blue Gap Tache, we have seen mostly uranyl vanadates. And this has been very important to understand the detailed mineralogy of these mine wastes because it enables us to understand what could be the dissolution processes effect on then having the presence of uranium in water and also in the solids. And also I wanted to show you another interesting data set that thanks to Johanna Blake and Sherry DeVore in my group put this data together showing that at the top you see uranium concentration and below you see discharge. So this is flow in the Rio Paguare, and the Sherry very nicely put in gray the months of June to September, which is usually our monsoon season. So you can see there that coincides where we see these elevated concentrations up to 700 micrograms per liter. And this is in a location that used to be the largest open pit mine in the world in the 60s at the Pueblo of Laguna. We still have, the villages of Paguari, Mesira, Laguna that are close to there. So this is an EPA national priority list for circa cleanup, and it's still pending. And what we have seen with our studies at, integrate transmission electron microscopy and other techniques is that you have the co-occurrence of reduced uranium-4, which is honestly surprising to me, especially after the decades that these mine waste have been exposed to surface oxidizing conditions, co-occurring with uranium-6. And for those of you who are not chemists, I just want to tell you that we have a lot of uranium here for us to be able to see it with microscopy and spectroscopy techniques. And we were also able to see the mineralogy, confirming that we have a uranyl silicate, a uranium silicate mineral called coffinite. So this actually gives us some insights because these uranium minerals co-occur and are encapsulated by carbon. So we're trying to understand what the role of this carbon encapsulation could be, both for maintaining the uranium in place or also for dissolution. And finally, because I don't want to leave you depressed here, I want to have some hope, and I'm gonna give credit to the creative thinking of people that I work with, Elian Hayek, and also Sherry DeVore, Lucia Rodriguez Freire, among many others, Johanna Blake, who is now in USGS. And could we use plants and natural minerals that are in place in these communities to immobilize these metal mixtures? That is a thought that I want to leave us today with, because if we understand then how these plants that are there here in the desert, if we see those plants growing with minerals that have been used because the primary remedial action or interim action has been to cap with non-contaminated soil. And what we have seen is that a lot of this soil contains calcite, which is rich in calcium and carbonate. And one of the things that we have tried to understand is how this calcium and carbonate affect the intake to plants. And what we have seen is that this co-occurrence of elements can actually help on the bioavailability for these plants to translocate and uptake these metals. And finally, Lucia, these are all TEM facilities from the University of New Mexico. So we're very proud to showcase this, and which are showing us how this uranium can be uptaken by plants, and see in detail that this is a process that happens in intracellular entrapment. So with that, just want to leave you with a picture of my group and the family. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I have a question for you,
Yeah.
Jose. If you were to use plants as a remediation method, what would happen to the uranium that the plants uptake? Would it still be in the system and a contaminant?
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. And quite honestly, why we started this research between you and I is because the community asked us this question. Jose, we have plants in these contaminated sites. The animals are actually eating them. Should we be concerned or not? So to answer your question, the plants are there. So we have to understand that, right? Independent of not they're used for remediation. But there are some very interesting discussions in the environmental engineering community as to what to do with the plants. The reality is that once you have, let's say, we have an approach that is very popular right now in the practitioners world called cap and plant. Okay, and what happens is you leave those caps in the plants, and that's how you leave them, right? So you raise a really excellent point. Then should we burn these plants? Should we do something with them to avoid that this accumulation is there? But I mean, quite honestly, this is still a very important topic that has to be discussed. And I think that I don't have for you today an answer that is easy, because it's actually a very complex question, the one that you ask. But a lot of sites leave these plants on site, and that's the approach of remediation. As long as they are on a site that is known to be remediated and managed, that's what's happening today.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jose, you showed that table with a wide range of contaminant levels, and I'm wondering, do you see lower contaminant levels in test wells near or in surface water in places where that sort of tap and plant sort of approach has been taken? In other words, do we see clear benefits from those kinds of remediation measures?
Yeah, well, in other sites that have done it, I have to be clear, Bill, that in a lot of these sites that we work with, there is no action yet. In fact, there are actually studies right now, and that's why the studies that we have done in the group shed lights, because they give the communities information, so that then they can know what where the uranium is, and also have evidence, quite honestly, to have communication with the Environmental Protection Agency, which is actually in charge of taking care of managing Superfund sites, right? So the reality is that in none of the sites that we work with, we have these approaches, and that's why this is research. What I can tell you is that there is partial capping, let's say, with uncontaminated soil in some of these sites. Unfortunately, Bill, what has happened is, if you go to Laguna Pueblo, or if you go to the Blue Gap Tache sites, which is I've been, yes, I think that the cover has helped, but that cover was placed back in the, maybe anywhere from the early 90s to early 2000s. And, after 21 years, you have erosion, right? So, yeah, I think that the problem is still there, and we have measured these concentrations still. So, there has been very little progress, and the approaches that I am discussing are for other sites that I am familiar with, that are managed by either the Department of Energy or the Environmental Protection Agency, but not these ones in the native communities that we work with.
I have a question. Jose, thank you for this presentation. It's great work that you're doing. I'm curious, with the animals that eat the plants that uptake this uranium, what effect does the use of animal products from those animals have upon the people who use those products, like the wool or the meat or perhaps the milk?
I can tell you a direct answer, which is, yeah, absolutely. I'll tell you a direct answer on the fact that we don't yet know how the uranium is accumulated in animals or other metals. Even there are some ongoing studies that I know my colleagues in the health sciences at UNM, in collaboration with the Northern Arizona University and other universities, are currently conducting to answer that. But I'll tell you that there is a stigma on the products that are raised in the tribes because of that, and people don't buy them. And they have complained about that there's just, people don't want to buy the products from them because they believe that they are not good enough. And so even if we don't know if the risk is, how high or low it is, there is definitely an economic price that they have paid for that.
What about the natives who consume these animals?
Yeah, I mean, they consume the animals, and they don't know the risk. I think that's where we are right now, and that's why we need studies, right? And I mean, it's a very sad situation, because that's why we need the funding. But I'm gonna have to say that another layer that I haven't talked about, and that brings a lot of satisfaction personally to me, is to have the opportunity to train Native American students, because we can attract them to STEM because they're working on a problem that is dear to them. They have a connection from generations to it. And it has been marvelous for me to see people that have done phenomenal things, like Sherry DeVore or Tiber Casus, Taylor Bush, who is right now working with us, Derek Capitan, who is working with us. So you see, I already tell you 4 Native American students in STEM that are doing research on this. So that is another layer that I hope can give sustainability to this, and hopefully help us attract more people to STEM. But we don't have good answers.
Yeah, Jose, I appreciate you ending on that positive, that positive note. All the talks today kind of signal to me that we've got our work cut out for us, and we have some of the tools we need. And it's going to take time to fix some of these problems and change our thinking in ways that we need to change it. So thanks to all of our presenters once again for giving us a broad view of the important work going on at UNM. And thank you all for being here today. Appreciate very much what all of you are doing.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate you guys. Thank